In the winter of 1878, when the cold pressed through every wooden beam and coal, smoke curled through the streets of Cedar Creek like the breath of something half asleep and waiting to awaken. A young substitute teacher named Ellen Hartwell stepped through the side entrance of First Methodist Church, expecting only to take over Sunday school duties. Wow! Miss Wilson recovered from illness, but what she found instead, beneath the creaking boards and behind the fading ledgers, would become the first rip in a veil that had been drawn tightly over the town's most beloved institution for over 2 years. And when that veil finally fell, when the records were read by someone not trained to ignore them, the truth that began to uncoil from beneath those floorboards would not just shatter the reputation of a church or the illusion of a program. It would dismantle the moral architecture of an entire community, brick by brick, soul by soul, memory by memory, until even those who had once sung hymns in its pews began to question if their own children had ever truly belonged to them, or if they too had only ever been names in a ledger waiting to be reassigned or erased. Ellen Hartwell was 24, trained formally at Indiana State Normal School. The daughter of a circuit preacher and a Sunday school instructor, she believed in routine, in pedagogy, in the divine authority of structure and record. And so when she sat down at Margaret Wilson's old desk and opened the black leather-bound ledgers that recorded weekly attendance, she was not expecting revelation or rupture. She was expecting arithmetic and order, but what she saw instead were names 48. Names that did not match the faces she saw in the classroom, nor the families who attended services, nor the quiet hum of the town around. Her names that were written with care, sometimes with annotations like gifted in recitation or struggles with Genesis, but always ending abruptly, always followed by notations like transferred to missionary training or moved to Illinois or joined traveling school, with not one returned, not one name, followed by any entry that confirmed reappearance, and that in itself might not have triggered alarm if Ellen had not cross-referenced the names with the congregation's family rosters, and found that many of these children did not have existing parents listed, nor siblings attending, nor addresses within the county. And when she brought up the names in casual conversation with the elder deacons, they looked puzzled or uncomfortable, or simply changed the subject, saying things like, "Oh, yes, I remember that one bright child, such a shame they had to move so young," or "Are you sure they were enrolled here? It all happened so fast back then." Ellen did not stop because something in her bones told her not to, and perhaps it was the way the pages felt too clean, or the way Margaret Wilson's careful handwriting changed slightly on certain entries, or the way Robert Hayes, chairman of the church board and town magnate, always seemed to walk past her with a slight hesitation, as if trying to remember whether he had already seen her that day, or whether she had seen too much. The truth was, Ellen had always been trained to look for patterns, and now she saw one. She could not explain or dismiss children, mostly from poor or immigrant families, selected for special excursions, offered opportunities for educational trips to places like Cincinnati or Louisville, but whose families no longer attended church or spoke their names, and whose supposed letters home had all gone missing from the file drawers, as if plucked out in the middle of the night by someone who knew exactly what they meant, and exactly who could never be allowed to read them. There were no accusations at first, only suspicions, only silence growing louder and louder, until one snowy morning Ellen dropped her pen beneath the old oak desk in the office and reached down to retrieve it, only to notice a seam in the floorboards that did not match the rest, and when she pressed against it, she found a looseness, a hollow echo, and a rusted brass ring, barely visible under layers of dust and wax. And when she pulled it open, the smell hit her first, not of death, not yet, but of damp fabric and iron, and something like old milk, something that made her throat tighten and her fingers tremble. And as she lowered herself into the dark crawl space beneath the church, she felt something that no one in that town had allowed themselves to feel in years: terror, not of hellfire or sin, but of human evil, so cold and so organized that it had been confused for divine order. Below the floorboards, she found trunks, dozens of them, plain wooden, containers marked with initials and numbers, and filled with the belongings of children who had supposedly left for better lives. Shoes, small dresses, slates, Bibles marked with names. That no longer appeared in church registries. One trunk contained nothing but hairbrushes, another with school assignments half finished, letters to mothers, never sent. But the worst was the silence, the knowing that no one had ever asked where these things had gone, or why they had never been returned to grieving parents, because there were no grieving parents, not anymore, only silent ones, resigned ones, missing ones, and some who had been given new land or jobs, or promises to stay quiet and loyal and Christian and grateful. She took one name from the ledger: Timothy Morrison, age 8, son of a German miner, who no longer attended church, no longer worked at the mines, and whose house had been boarded up since the previous winter. Ellen visited the home under pretense of illness relief, and found nothing but rotting wood and a broken cradle in the corner, and a half-torn photo tucked behind the hearth showing Timothy in front of the church, steps smiling, eyes wide and trusting, and the date on the back: October 1876, just days before he had been selected for a biblical archaeology trip to Kentucky. She confronted Margaret Wilson, who was too ill to speak, and Sarah Coleman, who met her with eyes too calm and hands too folded, and said, "Only some things are bigger than us, child. You must have faith." Ellen then brought the names to Robert Hayes, who smiled and said nothing, and closed his office door behind her with a sound that felt like finality. And the next day she found her teaching schedule changed, her access to the office revoked, and the church secretary quietly instructed to remove the old ledgers and store them in the vestry archives, which Ellen knew had no real catalog and no accountability. Still, she returned each night to the crawlspace now, with a candle and gloves and a notebook, copying names, copying labels, copying dates, because she understood now that what had happened was not isolated, was not error. It was design. It was a system. And she could feel it living inside the walls of that building, breathing behind every stained glass window, hiding in the warmth of every hymn. And she knew it had gone on too long to stop with her, and yet she could not stop. She had seen too much to forget, and too much to forgive. The trunks grew heavier as she counted them, 52 by the end of January, some with bloodstains, some with dried clay on the edges, some with ribbons still tied around the latches, as if their owners had packed eagerly, believing they were going on a journey. One trunk was larger than the others, and inside was not clothing, but restraints, padded and old, but still functional. And beside them, a set of instructions, written in Margaret Wilson's hand, describing how to keep a child still for long train rides without visible marks, how to prevent crying, how to keep the child from remembering anything but Scripture and obedience. And so Ellen Hartwell did what no one else had done. She wrote everything down, not in the church books, not in the official files, but in a journal of her own, hidden beneath her mattress and kept locked in a box marked personal curriculum. And in that journal she recorded what she saw, and what she feared, and what she suspected. And by the end of that winter she no longer believed the church was holy, or the community innocent, or the silence accidental. She believed it was all part of the same machine, a machine that took children from the poor and the voiceless and sent them somewhere else, not to learn, not to pray, not to grow, but to disappear. And in the stillness of that winter, with snow choking the fields and train whistles crying in the night, and the soft rustle of sermons echoing through empty halls, Ellen began to understand that she was not standing at the beginning of a scandal, but at the edge of something older and deeper, and far more protected than she had imagined, and that what she had found was not just proof of a crime, but the blueprint of an industry, one that ran through the veins of Cedar Creek, and perhaps through Every other town that had once believed education and religion could never be used for harm. But they had been used. They had been sharpened into tools and turned into masks and used by those who had learned that hope is the best bait and trust, the most silent weapon. And by the end of February, Ellen had stopped praying, not because she no longer believed, but because she feared that the God she had spoken to her whole life had seen it all and said nothing, and that silence was louder than any scream she had ever heard in her dreams. And still the town remained quiet, and still the sermons continued, and still the pews were full every Sunday, and still the children sang, and still the bells rang out across the farmland, and still beneath it all the trunks remained closed, and the Yancey names remained forgotten, and the ledgers remained hidden, and Ellen Hartwell remained the only one who could no longer sleep at night without hearing the echo of small hands tapping beneath the floorboards and the weight of all those names pressing against her chest like stones she would carry for the rest of her life. And if the story ended there, it would be horror enough. But it did not end. It only deepened. Because Cedar Creek was not chosen by accident. It was primed, selected, prepared, and in the next part, you will understand why the towns shape its history. Its soil and its silence made it the perfect place for what would come next. Cedar Creek had not always been a place that devoured its children. It had once been a sleepy stretch of farmland nestled between low hills and crisscrossed by deer paths and wagon trails where German immigrants planted corn beside Irish miners, and Methodist preachers held services in barns and under sycamore trees, and children ran barefoot through the fields without fear or destination. But by 1871, everything changed when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad reached its edge with a grinding shriek and a promise of progress and steel, and suddenly the quiet soil of Indiana trembled beneath the weight of industry, and something ancient and still was broken open beneath the town's feet, and what came rising through the cracks was not just coal or commerce, but hunger real and human and perfectly suited for exploitation. The arrival of the railroad did more than bring goods and passengers. It brought men with money and plans and the ability to rewrite a town's destiny in ink and contract. And when the landowners signed their names, they did not know that they were selling more than property. They were selling control. They were selling silence. They were selling the terms of who would matter and who would vanish. And into that new arrangement came men like Robert Hayes with his 2 grain elevators, and his controlling stake in the mines, and his clean black suit every Sunday morning seated on the front pew with a smile that did not touch his eyes. And when he built the limestone church with its twin towers and its stained glass windows imported from Cincinnati, he was not building for God, he was building for power. The church was never just a place of worship. It was a symbol, it was a gatekeeper, it was the arbiter of morality and social standing. And if your family sat close to the pulpit, or if your daughter sang in the choir, or if your son was chosen for an educational excursion, then doors would open, and debts would be forgiven, and jobs would appear like blessings, and land disputes would resolve in your favor. But if you asked too many questions, or if you came from the wrong country, or if your child didn't smile at the right time, then your name would slip quietly from the town's conversations, and your child would not be chosen, and your voice would not be heard, and your pew would grow cold. Religious affiliation in Cedar Creek was not about belief, it was about alignment. Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Lutheran, Catholic. All these titles became markers in a hierarchy that defined who deserved advancement and who deserved obscurity. And as the rail yards expanded and the coal trains rolled through the town every day, so too did the machinery of social control sharpen itself until faith became currency and children became its most valuable exchange, and no church used this currency more effectively than First Methodist, because it did not ask for obedience. It rewarded it, and when a family gave a child to Margaret Wilson's program, they were not losing a child. they were purchasing a future, or at least they believed. They were. The Methodists had always preached discipline and order and improvement, and these values fit perfectly with the needs of a town trying to civilize its exploding population. And so, when Margaret Wilson began offering biblical excursions and missionary placements, it was seen not as suspicion, but salvation. She had come from Philadelphia with glowing letters and city training, and in a town filled with uneducated preachers and coal soot, she gleamed like promise, and every family wanted her approval. Because it meant your child might leave Cedar Creek and return with education and refinement and letters behind their name, and possibly even escape the mines entirely. But what no one asked or dared to ask was where exactly these children were going and why none of them ever came back. The truth was that Cedar Creek had become a sorting ground, a way station for ambition and exploitation, and it had done so not by accident, but by deliberate design, because once the railroad arrived, and the money flowed, and the townsfolk began to see the church as the gatekeeper of status, the rest was simple: build the most modern church in the region, install a respected educator from the East, recruit children from the outskirts, and offer them opportunities too good to refuse, and then let the machine run in silence, because the best crimes are those that reward the onlookers, and the best conspiracies are the ones where everyone benefits just enough to keep from asking what the cost really is. And beneath all of this was the deeper truth that no one ever spoke aloud. The town itself was built on land that had been taken from others, first from native hands, then from early settlers, then from small farmers, who lost their plots in bad winters and quiet deals, and every time the land changed hands, someone else vanished into silence, and every time a church or rail station was built, someone's story was buried beneath the floor. And by 1878, the town had grown so used to this rhythm of disappearance that when it began happening to children, it was barely a change in pitch. It was just the next verse in a song already written in blood and deeds and prayers mouthed by people who had long since stopped believing that justice was coming. Ellen Hartwell would later realize that Cedar Creek was not just a location. It was a system, a template repeated across the Midwest, wherever the rails went, wherever the coal ran deep, wherever churches grew taller than schools and board members wore crosses on their lapels and silence on their tongues. And if it had not been Cedar Creek, it would have been somewhere else, some other town that believed too easily that God's work looked like progress, and that blessings only came to those who never asked where the children were taken and never read the names scratched into the trunks buried beneath their feet. And so the question that remained, the one Ellen would carry for the rest of her life, was not how could they have let this happen, but how many of them knew all along and chose to sing louder to drown the sound of what was happening below the altar. And in the dark and on the rails, headed west to places where children did not have names, only uses. And that was the real horror, not the silence of the church, or the sickness in Margaret Wilson's smile, or the coldness in Robert Hayes's bookkeeping, but the knowledge that a town could be so carefully reshaped that it would come to believe that losing a child was a sign of grace, that it could train its people to forget that they had ever loved at all. Margaret Wilson did not come to Cedar Creek by accident. She arrived in the spring of 1873 with 2 trunks, a worn Bible, a letter from the Philadelphia Board of Methodist Education, and a voice that could quiet a room full of shouting children in seconds. And what the townspeople saw when she first stepped into the pulpit classroom was not just a teacher, but a solution. She was 42 plain, but stern, with eyes that did not blink often, and hands that moved like she was always measuring something you could not see. And the letter she carried spoke of discipline, transformation, and spiritual rigor, terms that the men on the church board found respectable, terms that made them believe she could shape the town's rougher children into instruments of faith and order. But the letter did not mention what had happened at her last school, nor why the industrial home for destitute youth in Philadelphia had quietly dissolved her contract, nor what had become of the 13 children who had gone missing during her tenure there, their names scratched off registers with the same neat handwriting that would soon fill the ledgers of Cedar Creek Sunday School. The truth was Margaret had been preparing for something for years, something bigger than any one town, something systematic. She did not build programs. She built funnels, channels through which the weak, the unguarded, the unloved could be drawn, then repurposed, and what she found in Cedar Creek was not just opportunity, but compliance, a town primed by desperation and class envy and religious hierarchy, and the children. Oh, the children were everywhere, pressed between poverty and prayer. Brought in from outlying farms by parents who barely spoke English or worked 12-hour shifts underground, or believed that any blessing that came from the church must be divine, because what else did they have if not that belief? Within 2 years, Margaret Wilson had expanded the Sunday school from 43 students to over 200, drawing in children from surrounding counties, using carefully crafted pamphlets, testimonies from grateful parents, and sermons that praised the moral transformation of former troublemakers who now recited psalms and studied Latin and marched in parades. But what no one noticed, or what they refused to notice, was that for every 10 children who joined the program, 1 or 2 quietly vanished, always with a story, always with a reason, always with a letter of thanks that arrived weeks later, written in a hand that never quite matched the child's, and always ending with praise for Miss Wilson and her ability to see what others could not. Margaret taught with precision. She used shame and praise in equal measure. She separated siblings. She gave rewards to those who tattled on others. She promoted silence as virtue and curiosity. As sin, she memorized every child's fears and used them to guide behavior. And when a child showed signs of disobedience, she would isolate them, speak to them quietly in the vestry behind closed doors, where no one heard what was said, but after which the child would return pale, quiet, obedient, and sometimes not at all. And those who returned often spoke less than before and smiled only when told to, and avoided eye contact with the assistant teacher, Sarah Coleman, whose soft hands and gentle voice seemed to soothe their terror just enough to keep them in line. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. She studied the way children responded to authority. She recorded which ones cried when separated from their parents, and which ones tried to run. She had developed categories written in codes within the attendance books: compliant, strong, valuable, weak, defiant, high risk, and she kept separate ledgers hidden behind the sanctuary wall where names were marked not by academic merit, but by saleability, by demand, by arrangement, and those ledgers were never shown to church elders because they did not need to be. No one asked for more than numbers. No one wanted to see too much. No one wanted to believe that a woman who taught Bible verses with such clarity could also measure a child's value in terms of how long they would last on a work line, or in a private residence, or in places that the town maps did not show. And so she operated with impunity because she had built not just a program, but a narrative. And it was a narrative that the town needed to believe, the idea that Cedar Creek was producing exceptional children, moral children, educated children who were being offered opportunities far beyond what their parents could afford. And when a child disappeared, Margaret would say they had been selected for missionary work or advanced placement or private tutoring in another state, and the parents would nod, often with tears in their eyes, because they did not speak the language well enough to argue, or because they feared losing church sponsorship, or because they had been told again and again that doubt was the voice of Satan and gratitude was the only path to salvation. She chose her assistant carefully. Sarah Coleman had once worked in a Cincinnati orphanage known for strict discipline and high placement rates, and while her voice was gentle and her demeanor kind, she had a gift for seeing through children, for understanding what they feared and what they longed for, and under Margaret's direction, she began applying those insights to help shape the selection process, gathering emotional profiles, listening carefully when children spoke about home life, identifying which ones were most isolated or least likely to be remembered if they were gone for too long and always, maintaining the image of a nurturing caregiver, even as she fed information into a machine that turned innocence into inventory. By 1875, Margaret Wilson had earned the unwavering respect of the church board. She had delivered numbers, she had drawn attention from Methodist publications, she had spoken at regional conferences about educational reform, and in every speech she repeated the same phrases: moral uplift, spiritual discipline, productive futures, and none of the men who introduced her ever asked about follow-up visits or correspondence or reunions with families, because those things were not part of the model. Once a child was gone, they were gone with God, and anyone who asked more than that was showing a lack of faith. And it worked. It worked so well that by 1876, she had begun receiving inquiries from other towns, from churches in Illinois and Ohio, and even one in Kentucky, asking if she could take on special cases or recommend placements or provide training for similar programs, and Margaret always responded with grace and interest and suggestions of future collaboration, while quietly expanding the basement of the church, adding storage rooms and reinforced doors and hidden compartments, all funded by donations from parents grateful for the miracle of transformation that their children had supposedly received. But the miracles were lies, and the transformations were disappearances, and every letter sent to a family thanking them for their sacrifice was written by Sarah Coleman based on a template, and every name erased from the roster was logged elsewhere, under codes that described what had been paid and what had been promised. And every month Margaret sent updates, not to the church elders, but to a network of contacts who did not wear crosses and did not speak of God, and who paid well for predictability and silence. And that was the truth of Margaret Wilson, not a woman of faith, but a woman of systems, of control, of logistics and calculations. And every child who entered her program was studied and measured and assigned, and if they were lucky, they were simply relocated, but if they were not, they became something else, something that had a market value and a destination and a vanishing point, marked not by graduation, but by train schedules and handshakes in the back rooms of stations where no ticket was ever printed and no questions were ever asked. And so the town praised her, and the church promoted her, and the families thanked her, even as their homes grew quieter and their photo frames gathered dust, and the streets no longer echoed with the voices of children who once ran free, but who now lived only in the margins of ledgers written in ink that no rain would ever wash away, because by then it wasn't just Margaret's secret, it was the town's, and everyone had something to lose if the truth ever surfaced, which is why it didn't. Not until the day Ellen Hartwell stepped into that classroom and saw the names that didn't match the faces, and the silences that didn't match the hymns, and the stories that didn't end the way they were supposed to. And even then the truth fought hard to stay buried, and would take more than courage to be unearthed. It would take sacrifice. It would take obsession. It would take Ellen all the way into the darkness. Margaret Wilson had spent her life constructing brick by brick, name by name, child by child. Sarah Coleman was the kind of woman people trusted without question. She had a voice like a lullaby and eyes that never judged. She moved through the hallways of the church like a ghost of comfort, offering handkerchiefs to crying children and gentle reassurances to anxious mothers. Her dresses were always modest, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested humility, not concealment. And when she knelt beside a child and whispered softly in their ear, they listened because she made them feel seen, not watched. And in a town like Cedar Creek, where watchfulness was everywhere and comfort was rare, that kind of presence carried a strange and disarming power. But what no one understood, not then, not even Ellen Hartwell at first, was that Sarah Coleman was not an assistant. She was not a helper. She was not the background figure. Everyone assumed she was the mind behind the mask. She was the one who made the machine breathe. She had come to Cedar Creek in 1875, 2 years after Margaret. Wilson had established the program and the story. She told the church board was simple and touching a former worker at a Methodist mission in Cincinnati who wanted a quieter life, a woman, unmarried, childless, yet brimming with maternal instinct, who believed her calling was to nurture and educate children from troubled homes. Her references were pristine, her demeanor unimpeachable, and Margaret welcomed her not as an equal, but as an instrument, because what Margaret lacked in human subtlety, Sarah possessed in dangerous abundance. She could read a child's heart in a glance. She could disarm a parent with a nod, and most dangerously, she could disappear into a system without ever leaving fingerprints, and this made her invaluable. What Sarah brought to the operation was not just warmth, it was precision. She was the one who organized the emotional intelligence of the entire network, who categorized children, not just by age or obedience, but by personality attachment levels. Trauma response, history of affection, familial connection, language development, and perceived ability to endure isolation or indoctrination. Her methods were not guesses. They were tested models shaped over years in orphanages and homes where unwanted children were conditioned for usefulness. And when she applied those models to the children of Cedar Creek, she did so with the care of a scientist and the conviction of a priest. She believed in what they were doing, not just as a system, but as a philosophy that certain children were meant to be reshaped, removed, and repurposed, that families did not know what to do with such raw material, and that she and Margaret were offering salvation through transformation, even if it came at the cost of identity, memory, and sometimes breath. Sarah's primary tool was conversation, gentle moments by the fireplace, walks around the garden, stories whispered after prayer sessions. She would ask children how they felt about their parents, what they feared about school, what dreams they had. And she would listen not with sympathy, but with collection. She was building maps inside her mind, diagrams of emotional fracture and familial vulnerability. And once she knew where the cracks were, she could begin to widen them. Some children she prepared, slowly softening their ties to family through repeated suggestions that their gifts were misunderstood or their talents wasted. Others she separated, quickly replacing their trust in home with trust in her, with phrases like "you're special" and "your parents love you, but they don't understand you yet." And in this way, she began to untether them from the world they knew and guide them toward the places they would never return from. It was Sarah who wrote the letters to families, always in the child's voice, always filled with gratitude and small details meant to mimic authenticity, the name of a favorite hymn, a mention of a sibling's birthday, a drawing included at just the right time to suggest continuity and care. And the parents believed, because Sarah was the one who had told them their child was gifted, she was the one who had stood by their wagon the day of departure and promised to send updates, and she was the one who always remembered their names and smiled just enough to make them feel chosen. And so, when the letters arrived, the handwriting didn't matter, and the return address was never questioned, because people do not scrutinize what they want to believe. They protect it, they defend it, they let it live, even when something in them knows that it is already dead. But Sarah's influence did not end with children or parents. It extended into the leadership of the church, into the financial decisions of the board, into the minds of men who considered themselves too clever to be manipulated. She kept profiles on them too, stored in a locked drawer in the office. Margaret never entered lists of weaknesses and ambitions. The merchant whose wife had left him and whose business depended on Hayes's grain prices, the deacon whose son had been caught stealing and was only spared legal trouble after a quiet conversation with the sheriff, the choir director who drank and feared exposure. And every one of them had a reason to stay silent, to support the program, to speak highly of Sarah Coleman's devotion to children, and to look the other way when another child left, and no one asked why, because asking would mean opening their own lives to scrutiny. And in Cedar Creek, privacy was privilege, and truth was poison. Behind her softness was a coldness that only Ellen would later glimpse in the fragments of her journal entries written in a clean hand that belied the content inside. There were lists of children annotated with phrases like lacks parental attachment, high compliance, minimal resistance, suitable for long-term relocation, and there were diagrams of psychological pressure methods recorded, like recipes affection, followed by withdrawal suggestion, followed by reward, isolation, followed by gratitude. And in one entry, she wrote that the key to preparing a child for permanent removal was not breaking their spirit, but reshaping their loyalty, redirecting it from blood to ideology, from family to mission, from home to service. And she called it reformation. Not conditioning, not control, reformation, as if what she was doing was holy. And perhaps in her mind, it was perhaps she believed that some children were better off being removed, that the poor, the immigrant, the lost had no business raising the gifted, and that Cedar Creek's program was not a crime but a cure, but belief does not cleanse blood, and method does not excuse outcome. And the quiet madness of Sarah Coleman was that she never questioned the cost, because to her there were no victims, only necessary transformations. And every time she wiped a child's tears or held their hand before a journey, she was not lying. She was simply executing a process, one she had perfected, and one she would continue perfecting until the moment her body betrayed her. Because in January of 1878, Sarah fell ill, not suddenly, but slowly, a cough that lingered, a weakness in her arms, a thinness to her frame, and the doctor called it consumption, and Margaret called it inconvenience, and the board called it God's will. And none of them understood that without Sarah, the system would falter, because Margaret could manage logistics, and Hayes could fund transport, but only Sarah knew the stories, the fears, the profiles, the lies that needed maintaining, and without her the mask began to slip, and Ellen, Hartwell, newly hired and still unaware, would begin to see the cracks. Not because she was clever, but because Sarah was no longer there to smooth the surface. And as Sarah lay in her room, coughing blood into a cloth, she kept writing entries not about pain or prayer, but about succession, about preserving the structure, about training someone new, someone who could carry on the work, not just the logistics, but the faith, the belief that what they were doing mattered, that it was necessary, that it was sacred. And those final pages, those last fevered notes, would be the ones Ellen found months later, hidden beneath the floorboards behind a panel marked with a name that was not Sarah's, but had been used for correspondence, because Sarah Coleman had never existed, not in the way people thought she had, and the name on her birth certificate did not match the one in church records, and the place she claimed to be from had no record of her employment. And in the end, Ellen would realize that Sarah was not just an accomplice, she was the architect, the mind, the soul of a system, built not just to hide what was done, but to believe in it. And that belief was the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant the crimes of Cedar Creek were not acts of desperation. They were acts of conviction, and conviction is a kind of evil that cannot be reasoned with. It can only be exposed, and even then it will try to survive. And as the town prayed for Sarah's recovery, as the children drew her cards and the parents brought flowers to her window, no one knew that beneath her bed, wrapped in linen and sealed with wax, was a ledger written in code, a record of names and dates and destinations and prices. And that ledger would not be found until long after she died, and by then it would be too late for most of them, because the names were already dust, the children already repurposed, the silence already sealed, and the only thing left was the growing suspicion in one woman's mind that something holy had been used to commit something monstrous, and that the most dangerous people in the world are the ones who do harm with a smile and a hymn and a gentle hand on the shoulder, telling you everything will be all right when they already know It never will be again. The excursions began as whispers promises woven through sermons and passed from parent to parent, like sacred invitations, carefully chosen words, like advancement and calling and divine opportunity wrapped in the authority of Margaret Wilson's voice and sealed by the soft assurances of Sarah Coleman. And for the families of Cedar Creek, already stretched thin by labor hunger and the slow erosion of hope, the idea that their child could travel beyond Indiana, could see the world could be, molded into something holy and useful, and admired, was more than a gift. It was proof that God had not forgotten them. And so they said yes. They always said yes, even when something inside them twisted, even when their youngest cried at the thought of leaving, even when the goodbye felt too permanent to be only temporary, because who questions salvation when it arrives with a handshake from the church? These excursions were never simple trips. They were weeks-long, carefully plotted, with schedules, maps, and letters of commendation addressed to Methodist institutions across the Midwest, from Ohio to Illinois, and even as far south as Tennessee, and they were cloaked in language that made refusal feel like blasphemy. Your child has been selected. Your son shows unusual spiritual aptitude. Your daughter has a gift for language that could serve the mission field. And who could say no to such things? Who would risk being seen as ungrateful when other families waited and hoped their children might be chosen next? And so the wagons rolled in, and the trunks were packed, and the small shoes lined up neatly by the doors, and no one thought to ask how a town of 3,000 could support so many educational expeditions, or why only a few children ever returned with stories to tell. What the townspeople did not know, what they were never allowed to see, was that the excursions were not about education or travel or spiritual enrichment. They were about disappearance, the slow, clean removal of children from the visible world too. A space between truth and denial, a space where records blurred and distances made accountability impossible. And Margaret Wilson had designed it all with the precision of a military campaign train schedules, timed to the hour, forged letters prewritten and signed by children who never held the pen contacts in shipping yards and parsonages, who received packages without questions, who signed no logs, who sent no replies. And over time, this process became smoother, faster, more profitable, because once a system learns how to move a body without consequence, it begins to forget that the body ever had a name. Each child was prepared differently based on Sarah Coleman's assessments. Compliant children were told they were missionaries' heroes, examples of divine purpose. Rebellious ones were isolated, given chores, withheld affection, then offered the trip as a reward, a transformation. And in each case, the departure was framed as sacred, not a loss, but an elevation, and parents clung to that belief even when weeks became months, even when no letters came, even when the others stopped talking about the trip, because the shame of being the only one who doubted the church was worse than the fear of losing a child. And when neighbors asked, they smiled and said, "Oh yes, Timothy is in Kentucky learning archaeology, and Mary Catherine is helping establish a school in Illinois." And the stories were always the same, detailed enough to satisfy, vague enough to forget. There was never a return date. That was the brilliance of it, the vagueness, the suggestion that missionary work took time, that spiritual development could not be rushed. And so the church built stories instead of answers, and the community began to measure its success, not in who came home, but in who left, and how noble their absence was said to be. And as more children vanished, the value of the program grew, the myth deepened, the belief that Cedar Creek was producing exceptional young minds capable of serving God in ways no one else could match. And even the families who had doubts kept silent, because what if they were wrong? What if their child really was somewhere holy, doing something magnificent? And what if their own grief, their own suspicion, was the real sin? Behind the scenes, Margaret Wilson managed every detail. She tracked train routes and telegraph delays. She adjusted selection rosters to avoid suspicion, alternating genders, ages, family backgrounds, so no clear pattern emerged. she ensured that no two children from the same family left at once, unless the family was large and desperate, and would consider it a double blessing. She maintained a calendar that mapped not just dates, but emotional rhythms, when a mother was grieving, when a father was distracted by mine injuries, when the town was focused on revival week. And these were the moments she chose to announce the next excursion, always with a smile, always with an open Bible, always surrounded by grateful parents nodding and praying, and thanking God for his mysterious ways. What made the excursions effective was the illusion of prestige. Margaret's excursions were not for just anyone. They were for the promising, the special, the marked. And so parents competed for favor, dressed their children in better clothes, memorized verses to recite before services, volunteered more hours for church events. And slowly the desperation of survival became the desperation of selection. A hunger not for safety, but for proximity to holiness. And in this atmosphere, the disappearances ceased to feel strange. They became expected. And when someone asked too many questions, they were reminded that faith is not about proof, it is about trust. And who were they to question the will of God or the intentions of his most trusted servant? The children never knew what waited for them. Some were handed off to labor rings in Chicago factories, others to wealthy homes where domestic service was little more than captivity. Others were sold directly to institutions that operated under the guise of boarding schools or hospitals, but had no patience, only rooms and silence and long corridors, filled with the sounds of breathing and nothing else. And none of them ever came back, not because they died, though some did, but because returning was never part of the contract. Once they were gone, and the machine moved on, and new names were selected, and new wagons rolled in, and new parents wept at the altar, thanking God for choosing their child. And Robert Hayes ensured that everything moved without friction. He used his influence over the railroad, his business contacts in neighboring states, his quiet deals with shipping clerks and station agents, and in exchange, he was granted a piece of the revenue, sometimes directly, more often as donations to the church expansion or favorable shipping contracts. And because Hayes controlled so much of Cedar Creek's economy, no one dared question his role. No one refused his requests. No one believed that the man who paid for new hymnals could also pay to have children erased. It was Hayes who proposed using the church's new basement as a staging area, its private rooms and storage spaces perfect for holding children overnight between transfers. It's soundproof, walls a blessing for the restless and fearful. It's hidden, stairways designed not just for discretion, but for containment. And when the basement renovations were complete, when the new rooms were finished and painted and locked, Margaret sent a letter not to a bishop, but to a contact in Toledo with a single sentence: "We are ready." And from that moment forward, the excursions increased in number and efficiency, and the basement saw more children than the sanctuary. There were weeks when 3 or 4 children were taken in silence, slipped into wagons after dusk, led through side doors, marked for storage, not salvation, and no one heard them, and no one saw them, because by then the entire community had been trained not to see, trained not to hear, trained not to remember. And in this way, the program survived for years, unchallenged, expanding and refining and consuming, until the church itself was no longer a place of worship, but a portal, a funnel through which the unwanted were turned into something profitable and sacred and lost. And Ellen Harpwell, who had only just begun to catalog the current rosters, had not yet realized how many names she was not seeing, how many children were never entered into her files because their names had already been erased from the official records, already marked in the hidden ledgers, already tagged for transfer before she ever lit the stove in her tiny teacher's quarters. And it would take time for her to see it, to feel the silence around certain names, the 2 clean stories, 2 perfect disappearances. And by the time she did, the excursions had already taken their final shape, and what she would uncover would not just be a trail of vanished children, but a blueprint, a design, a dark gospel written not in Scripture, but in the absence of memory and the presence of money and power and the terrible silence that happens when a town prays for its children, even as it forgets their names. The first disappearance was not a disappearance at all, not then, not to the people, who watched it happen, because there was no scream, no blood, no broken lock, or frantic search party, only a quiet Sunday afternoon in September 1876, when 8-year-old Timothy Morrison climbed into the back of a wagon, his small hands gripping the sides as Margaret Wilson pressed a folded letter into his mother's trembling fingers and whispered something about divine purpose and biblical archaeology and blessings that come in strange forms. His parents, both new to Cedar Creek, both barely able to speak English, nodded and wept and waved as the wagon rolled away. And that was it. That was the moment the story began, and no one called it what it was. They called it opportunity. Timothy had been one of the quiet ones, bright, obedient, quick to memorize Scripture, and quicker still to follow instructions, the kind of child Sarah Coleman had marked early in her private notes as highly compliant, emotionally open, minimal resistance. Ideal candidate. And when the letter arrived from a supposed family in Kentucky, requesting a boy of exceptional biblical interest to assist in archaeological research, his name rose to the top. Because that family did not exist, the research was a lie. The excavation site was a myth, but the destination was real, a mining town far enough away that no one would think to ask questions, and no one there would know his real name. 2 weeks later, Mary Catherine Phillips left with similar blessings. Her widowed mother, exhausted and desperate, had been told that a Methodist mission in Illinois needed a bright young girl to assist with frontier education that she would learn, to teach that she might one day open her own school and bring honor to her family. And the mother believed it, because she wanted to believe it, because in a world of scrubbing floors and washing sheets, what else was there to hope for? And so she handed her daughter over and never saw her again. And when the promised letters never came, when the months turned to seasons, she told herself that mail could be lost, that travel was dangerous, that silence was holy, when in truth it was a cage. By Christmas, 6 more children were gone, each selected with care, each story tailored to the family's fears and dreams. Some went to distant relatives, some to theological institutes, some to missions in places so remote they existed only on maps, drawn by men who had never been there. But the pattern was always the same: a child praised for their promise, a parent softened by reverence. An opportunity presented a departure, arranged a letter, received then silence, and after the silence, nothing. Because silence was the final trick, it made parents ashamed to ask, made neighbors unsure if they had ever known the child at all. And Margaret Wilson counted on that shame, and Sarah Coleman cultivated it, because silence is not passive, it is engineered. But the truth, the deeper truth, was that the disappearances were not random. They were not acts of convenience, they were acts of calculation. Sarah's notes revealed a logic colder than anyone could have imagined. She selected children not just based on family vulnerability, but on market demand, boys with strong arms for coal shafts and textile mills, girls with soft features for service houses and worse. Some chosen for labor, others for companionship, others for more hidden purposes. And every child was tagged not with a number, but with a price and a purpose, and her journals listed them like inventory. This one for domestic duty, this one for industrial labor, this one for discreet placement where English is not required. And Margaret facilitated it all with sermons and smiles, with paperwork and prayer circles, because she knew how to turn faith into obedience and obedience into disappearance, and the congregation praised her for it. They called her saintly admired. How she transformed troubled children into model students, never asking why the most gifted always seemed to vanish and never returned, never questioned why the Sunday school had fewer and fewer older children, and more photographs of the departed framed and captioned with phrases like called to service or answered. The higher calling as if the children had been promoted, not removed. Each time a child vanished, another took their place. The program grew stronger. The myth deepened. Families from farther and farther away sent their sons and daughters because they heard the stories, because they believed the lies. Because in an age where education was rare and religion was law, Cedar Creek offered both with a ribbon on top, and those who hesitated were reminded of God's plan and the sin of doubt and the need to trust those appointed by the Lord. And that fear, that guilt, that sacred manipulation became the final lock on the door. And once closed, it did not open again. But the machine did not run on lies alone. It needed structured transport papers, names that would not be questioned. And that is where Robert Hayes became more than a benefactor. He became an architect. He used his connections to acquire forged documents. Church credentials, birth certificates, they could be rewritten or replaced, and he made sure the children were not just gone, but legally erased, relocated with clean slates and no trail. And his warehouses held more than grain. They held ledgers, contracts, shipments masked as textiles or tools or livestock. And the authorities never looked, because Hayes owned the law, or at least enough of it to make sure that no one asked what was inside the wagons that left his yards after midnight. And so the disappearances continued, and the town adjusted to the absence of voices once heard in the pews, to the empty chairs at the school tables, to the quiet faces of grieving mothers who no longer spoke their child's name, because speaking it invited questions, and questions brought shame, and shame brought judgment. And so they kept quiet and prayed harder and gave more money to the church and told themselves that perhaps one day they too would receive a letter telling them that their child had been blessed and transformed and returned. But the letters never came because there were no returns. There were only exits. And still no one resisted, not openly, not until Ellen Harkwell, not until she noticed the inconsistencies, not until she asked why certain children were listed as departed, but never recorded as enrolled in any other institution, why the dates never matched the records, why some families no longer spoke of their children at all. And she began to ask gently at first, then more directly, and each answer she received was too perfect, too polished, like a script recited too many times. And she began to feel the shape of something hidden, something immense, something that moved beneath the surface of Cedar Creek like a river of rot beneath a garden of crosses. But at that time, in the winter of 1877, the program was still intact, still trusted, still praised in the local Methodist bulletins as a model of progressive Christian education, and the children still lined up in rows every Sunday, and the parents still nodded and smiled and handed over their futures to a woman they believed could save them, not knowing she had already sold them, and that the prayers they whispered in the dark were not for protection, but for purchase, and the God they were. Calling to had long since left the room, or perhaps he had never been there at all. Only Margaret, only Sarah, only Hayes, only the ledger, only the lock, only the lie, only the silence that deepened with every name removed from the rolls and every body sent away into the cold, unreachable dark, where the names of children are no longer spoken, and the memory of them becomes too dangerous to keep alive. The selection process was never random. It was never about merit or holiness or the Lord's mysterious will. It was about control, about targeting, about refining the disappearance of children into a process so smooth, so believable, so sanctified, that even the families left behind would kneel in gratitude instead of grief. And Margaret Wilson had perfected it with a precision that no headmaster, no missionary, no orphan master had ever dared to attempt. She did not take just any child. She took the right child, the one whose absence would not ripple too loudly, the one whose family was too foreign or too broken or too desperate to raise their voice above a whisper when they were gone. Immigrant families were always the first choice, not just because they lacked social standing, but because their language, their customs, their unfamiliarity with American systems made them easy to isolate, easy to confuse, and most importantly, easy to dismiss if they complained when German mothers cried in accents too thick to be taken seriously, when Polish fathers begged for answers from men who wouldn't meet their eyes. The town barely noticed, and the church did not respond, and when Sarah Coleman sat beside those parents with her folded hands and gentle voice, they listened because they had been taught that the church was their only anchor in a country that barely wanted them alive. Widowed mothers were also valuable. Margaret called them faith-worn, and always said the Lord had a special purpose for women who had suffered loss they were too tired to question, too busy to resist, always working, always praying, always just barely surviving. And when their child was chosen, when Sarah delivered the letter, they were told this was God's mercy, a reward for their obedience, a gift meant only for those strong enough to let go. And they cried that they agreed. And once the child was gone, their pain was interpreted not as suspicion, but as faith deepened by sacrifice. And so they remained quiet and obedient and alone. Large families offered another kind of cover when one of 6 children disappeared. The absence could be absorbed. The routines continued. The house remained loud and full, and the parents, who already struggled to feed so many mouths, welcomed any reprieve that came wrapped in Scripture and sealed with church approval. And Margaret took full advantage, offering her choices as a blessing, a thinning of the burden, dressed in the language of opportunity. And when a son or daughter vanished from a home already stretched past breaking, no one saw it as theft, only as providence, as if God himself had come down and lightened the load. But the darkest part, the part even Sarah kept to herself, the part buried deep in the margins of her journal, was the evaluation system, the way children were judged not by their souls or their faith, but by their usefulness in the hidden markets. Their market value, she called it, not with cruelty, but with detachment, as if she were cataloging livestock. Not lives boys under 12, with lean frames and strong hands, were ideal for millwork or coal chutes, places where adult bodies could not fit, and where the sound of crying could be buried under machinery. Older girls with fair features and a sense of obedience fetched higher prices in domestic placements, which was a lie. Everyone knew domestic meant something else, and no one ever came back from those placements, and no one ever asked where they had gone. Children were interviewed without knowing it, spoken to in corners during Sunday school, asked about their dreams, their fears, their families, their preferences, and Sarah wrote it all down, not in ledgers, but in delicate cursive hidden in hymn books. And behind false bindings she wrote down who clung to their parents, and who did not, who spoke quickly, and who stuttered, who showed signs of defiance, and who would follow any voice that sounded kind. And in this way she developed a profile not just of each child, but of their destiny. And when the right match came through her network, when a name appeared from Chicago or Toledo or Lexington with a specific request for a type of child, Sarah knew exactly who to send, and Margaret made it happen without delay. The Sunday school program was the perfect laboratory, the perfect funnel through which observation, conditioning, and selection could take place under the guise of care and education. Children were watched closely from the moment they enrolled. Those who showed signs of resistance were kept close monitored, but often left alone unless demand required their type. Those who showed signs of loyalty were praised, given extra attention, made to feel special, and those who fell in between were tested, subtly denied privileges, then rewarded, suddenly shown favoritism, then ignored. And Sarah tracked their responses with cold precision until she knew which ones would obey, even when it hurt, even when they knew it was wrong, even when they sensed they were being led not to salvation, but to something else. Letters were the second layer of control. Once a child was removed, a forged letter would arrive within weeks, carefully crafted in the child's voice, or what Sarah imagined it would sound like, always cheerful, always filled with gratitude, always lacking any identifying details. The letters were copied in Sarah's hand, but aged with time and dirt and sent through indirect routes to obscure the origin, and parents displayed them proudly convinced that every word had been written by their child, convinced that the silence between letters meant growth, not absence, and when too much time passed and questions began to bubble, Sarah sent one final message, always the same: your child is being called to higher service. Please trust in God. And never reply, and no one ever did. The entire town became complicit, not through action, but through inaction, through belief so strong it became blindness. They saw the pews emptying, the Sunday school rosters shrinking, the faces missing from the end-of-year photographs, and they said nothing, because the lie was too beautiful to destroy the idea that Cedar Creek had become a holy place, a place of transformation, a place where children were not lost, but elevated, and the church soaked in that belief. It grew fat and loud and powerful, draped in stained glass and velvet robes, while the bones beneath its floorboards remained quiet and still and forgotten. Sarah Coleman's most terrifying skill was not her manipulation of children, but her manipulation of adults. She knew how to speak to a grieving mother, how to place a hand on a trembling shoulder, how to lower her voice when delivering bad news so it sounded like prophecy instead of horror. She kept detailed notes, not just on the children, but on their families, on the way a father's face changed when his wife was mentioned, on the way a mother's eyes shifted when asked about money, on which families owed debts, which families had no allies, and which families could vanish just as easily as their children. And she used those notes to build walls around herself, walls of control, walls of silence. And Margaret relied on her completely, never made a move without her input, trusted her intuition above all else. And the two of them became something less than human and more than human at once, not merely criminals, not merely conspirators, but conductors of a symphony no one else could hear, a symphony of absence played on the backs of children whose names were turned into paper, and promises in silence. And Margaret read the notes, and Sarah tuned the instruments, and the church sang louder and louder, and no one heard the screams because the music was so holy. What few realized, what even the conspirators may have forgotten, is that the more children were taken, the easier it became. The town adjusted its expectations, reduced its memory, shortened its prayers, and eventually the disappearances became routine, became history before the fact became something you felt but could not name, like the smell of damp stone or the chill that creeps in through closed windows. And the fear became part of the church itself, woven into the wood, soaked into the hymnals, hidden in the eyes of those who still attended but never asked why. So many shoes were left behind, and so few ever returned to fill them. And somewhere deep beneath all of this, beneath the lies and the prayers and the praise and the blood, was the knowledge that something had shifted permanently, that Cedar Creek was no longer a town with a church, but a machine with a pulpit, a mouth that swallowed the poor and the voiceless and the hopeful and turned them into silence. And Sarah Coleman recorded every note of that silence with the calm of a scientist and the coldness of someone who believed she was not evil, only necessary. And her journal became a Bible of another kind, a holy text for those who knew that faith without witness is the most dangerous thing of all. By the winter of 1877, the operation had grown too large for one town to contain, and Margaret Wilson knew it, and so did Robert Hayes and Sarah. Coleman had already begun drawing maps in the back pages of her journal, charting distances between small Methodist churches, marking rail lines with red pencil lines, drawing invisible arteries across the Midwest through which children could be moved, like goods, like livestock, like secrets too valuable to be stored in one place for long. And the network that emerged was not born overnight. It was grown carefully, slowly, nurtured with gifts and letters and favors, exchanged behind closed doors between pastors and businessmen who saw in Margaret not a criminal, but a pioneer, a woman turning church charity into profitable coordination. And all it took was one shared doctrine, One shared silence to bind them together in holy complicity. The railroad changed everything. The Baltimore and Ohio line had arrived in Cedar Creek in 1871, and by 1877 it stretched like a spine across Indiana into Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky, reaching towns where church records were sloppy, where families were transient, where oversight was laughable, and Hayes's connections meant that cargo could move without questions, that cars could be marked as carrying tools or flour or Bibles, and no one would check because the labels came with signatures. The signatures came with donations, and the donations came with sermons praising the moral courage of commerce. And when a child was sent down the line, they vanished into the cracks between counties, between parishes, between names that no longer matched the faces printed in Sunday school rosters. Margaret wrote letters on fine stationery. She sent them to pastors in small towns who had once met her at Methodist conferences, who remembered her speeches on education and reform, and who trusted her when she spoke of burdened families, of brilliant children in need of new homes, of opportunities that must not be wasted. And those pastors, some of them men with clean hands and others with fingers already stained by other shadows, agreed to host children from Cedar Creek, agreed to accept the donations that came with them, agreed to send no questions back, only quiet nods and folded hands. And when Sarah provided forged background papers and Ellen's attendance ledgers were quietly rewritten, no one noticed, because the records were never meant to match the truth, only to protect the machinery that fed them. Hayes expanded the warehouse on the south edge of town, added a private platform allowed by a special permit from a state inspector whose wife received a position on the board of a Methodist orphanage weeks later, and that warehouse became the transfer point. Children were brought there at night, kept in small rooms with clean beds and hot meals, because a healthy child fetched a higher price, and Margaret insisted on appearances, and from there they were loaded onto trains with tags, not names, destinations, not origins. And once the train pulled away, the child ceased to exist in Cedar Creek and began to exist somewhere else, under a new name or under no name at all. And even if a parent somehow escaped their silence, even if they traveled, even if they shouted in broken English to a sheriff in a county 100 miles away, there was no trace to follow, no records to compare, no body to find. Sarah's journals became darker in this period, not frantic but clinical. She described the expansion with satisfaction, detailed how demand was increasing in urban centers for obedient girls and durable boys, and how the church's reputation made Cedar Creek a trusted source among the growing underground of religiously protected labor exchange. And the term she used was divine placement, a phrase borrowed from Methodist rhetoric twisted into a code, and she wrote that the system worked best when the children believed in their mission, when they left thinking they were chosen, when they stepped into darkness with songs on their lips and hope in their hearts, because hope was a leash, and Margaret was its handler, and the other pastors who accepted these children into their homes or sold them onward to the highest bidder rarely saw themselves as predators, only as administrators of divine economy. The network included over a dozen churches by March of 1878, some large, some forgotten, most located in towns where coal or rail or timber provided excuses for movement and noise and loss, and where a child arriving by train could be absorbed without notice, especially if they came wearing clean clothes, with a note signed by a respected minister and a donation for their care. And Hayes managed the logistics, while Sarah refined the emotional strategy, and Margaret spoke at conferences about the glory of rural education. And every time she was praised in newsletters or applauded in meetings, another doorway opened, another line added to the map, and the children kept moving west and south and east, sometimes even north, and the only direction they never moved was home. The profits multiplied faster than even Hayes had expected, and the church used them well new stained glass windows imported from Ohio, a pipe organ from St. Louis velvet pew cushions, gas lamps in the vestibule, and all of it presented as gifts from a grateful community, as donations from faithful congregants who never questioned why every campaign exceeded its goal, never asked where the sudden wealth had come from, and even when whispers spread about the size of the offerings about the children who had once attended and now did not, about the Sunday school classes growing younger and younger every year, those whispers dissolved into sermons about sacrifice, about the mystery of God's plan, about the holiness of obedience, and the silence returned heavier than before, like snow on a shallow grave. Margaret used the growth to mask the rot. She introduced new programs, scripture memorization contests, hymn composition groups, pen pal arrangements with fictional Methodist students in distant towns, all of them designed to create the illusion of progress, and all of them populated with fewer and fewer older children, until only the youngest remained, and new parents. New families continued to enroll their sons and daughters, dazzled by the building, the reputation, the promises, not knowing that they were standing on a trapdoor held shut by years of prayer and profit. And Sarah kept meticulous records of the network, wrote down which churches accepted the most children, which ones required additional persuasion, which ones asked too many questions and were removed from the loop, and she recorded which pastors seemed eager and which seemed afraid, and she noted every weakness, every debt, every hunger, because leverage was the final thread in the web, and once someone took one child, once they accepted one gift, they were bound forever, and she called it the covenant, and Margaret called it expansion, and Hayes called it business, but none of them called it what it was, which was trafficking, sanctified by Scripture and sealed with the blood of children whose screams were drowned by the rattle of steel wheels on cold tracks. There were others involved, men in suits who never came to Cedar Creek, but sent telegrams coded and careful, requesting specific shipments using religious euphemisms and quantities phrased as verses, and Sarah translated these with ease because the darkness was no longer shocking. It was routine, and when she wrote back, she used passages from Psalms as reference numbers, and Hayes ensured the trains ran on time, and Margaret continued to stand at the pulpit each Sunday, her voice unwavering, as she spoke of salvation and suffering and the path of righteousness, while beneath her feet the foundation rested on deeds so black that even the stones wept in silence. And the town remained unaware, or pretended to be. They saw the rail yard expand, the warehouse grow, the church rise higher and brighter, and they chose to see blessing, not cost. They chose to believe their children were special, that they had been chosen, and that those who never returned must be too important, too righteous, too holy to come home. And in this way the network grew, not because of secrecy alone, but because of willful blindness, because it is easier to believe a lie that offers hope than a truth that demands action. And so they believed, and the children vanished, and the trains kept running, and the prayers kept rising, and no one dared to ask what happened to the ones who never sent letters, never came back, never made it past the platform into the light again. And if a stranger asked where the children had gone, the town would shrug or smile or point to the church and say that Cedar Creek was a place of miracles, a place where lives were transformed, where the lost were found and the weak made strong. And no one would say the truth, that Cedar Creek was a place where innocence was traded for influence, where God was not worshipped, but worn like a mask, and behind that mask were the hands of Margaret and Sarah and Hayes, and behind them 100 more hands and 100 more towns, all tied together by rail and by faith and by silence, so thick and so deep that even God could not hear the cries that still echoed beneath the stained glass and velvet pews. And so it ended, not with fire, not with justice, not even with noise, but with a slow forgetting, like a fog rolling in over graves that were never marked, a silence cultivated over decades by those who understood the truth is only as strong as the will to carry it. And in Cedar Creek, that will had long since died, the year was 1879, when Ellen Hartwell left town, her contract quietly terminated her final report, sealed by the church board, never filed with the superintendent's office her questions. Dismissed as improper, her record-keeping called obsessive, and when she tried to speak to the local paper, she was told there were more pressing stories and more deserving children, and when she wrote letters to Methodist headquarters, they went unanswered. One by one, and eventually she stopped writing. The church continued its services, the pews filled, the children sang, and every mention of the vanished was erased with practiced calm, even the rosters, or rewritten old names replaced by new ones, photos trimmed to exclude the missing, and the basement was sealed officially for renovations, unofficially, because even Margaret could not bear what had begun to stain the air beneath the pulpit, the smell of dust and memory and something else. And Sarah Coleman died the following year, her body consumed not by consumption, but by something deeper, something she never named, and Margaret stood at her funeral and spoke of her as a saint, and not a soul in that sanctuary dared to disagree, because to disagree would mean remembering, and remembering was not allowed. Robert Hayes continued his businesses until 1883, when a train derailment claimed his life. The papers praised his philanthropy, his vision, his commitment to Cedar Creek's prosperity, and the church bells rang for him, as they had for Sarah, as they would one day for Margaret, who left the town in 1885 with a purse of donations and a new mission post in Kentucky, and no one asked why she did not return, and no one questioned why her replacement found the Sunday school rosters full of unfamiliar names and blank spaces and no returning alumni, and when he did ask questions, he too was transferred within a year, and the pattern continued long after the principals had vanished, because the system no longer needed them. It had become self-sustaining, fed by silence, blessed by obedience, guarded by tradition. The children who vanished were spoken of only in private, only in whispers, only as warnings to other children, about obedience, about the cost of disobedience, and their names became ghosts in their own homes, etched not in stone but in the backs of old drawers behind cracked photographs, where faces had been scratched out or forgotten, and the parents aged and died, many never speaking of what had been taken from them, some never realizing the loss, others realizing it too late and finding that their grief had no altar, no grave, no ceremony, and so they carried it in their bones until their bones were buried too, and Cedar Creek moved on. By the turn of the century, the church had been rebuilt again, larger, brighter, its basement sealed with new concrete, its past rewritten in stained glass, and no mention of the disappearances remained, not in sermons, not in archives, not in memories. And when the centennial booklet was printed in 1974, it contained glowing paragraphs about the progressive legacy of the Methodist educational program, but not one word about the 50 children, not one date, not one name, not one question. And when asked about it by a visiting historian, the current pastor laughed and said no such program ever existed, and perhaps he believed it, and perhaps that was the point. And now the town stands, as so many do, rows of homes, rusted rail lines, a church that still sings on Sunday mornings, and beneath it all silence. And when children go missing elsewhere, when patterns emerge, when whispers grow into rumors, there are those who remember Cedar Creek not by name, not by date, but by feeling a cold in the marrow, a hush in the air, a suspicion in the eyes of those who speak too carefully and care too much about appearances. And the truth is this: there are more Cedar Creeks than anyone wants to admit, more churches, more towns, more forgotten names, more floorboards that conceal not just bodies, but systems, built by good people, by faithful people, by people who believed they were chosen, and who chose to forget. And as long as no one speaks their names, as long as records are rewritten, as long as prayers are louder than questions, they will remain hidden, and they will remain protected. Because in America, memory is not preserved, it is managed, and horror is not erased, it is baptized. And so the children of Cedar Creek remain not in history books, but in the silence that follows every mention of miracle programs and educational, missions and church reform, and in the shiver that crawls up your spine when you walk alone through a town too proud, too clean, too quiet. And if you ask too many questions, the pews will close around you, the doors will lock, and the choir will rise, and no one will remember your name, not because they never knew it, but because they were taught not to. And that is the real horror, not the children taken, not the system that fed on them, not the men and women who built it brick by brick, but the silence that followed, the silence that buried them, the silence that still speaks louder than God. And now you know, and the question is not whether you believe, but whether you will remember. Because once you've heard it, you cannot unhear it. Once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand what Cedar Creek was, you begin to see its shape in places you thought were safe. And you wonder how many more towns, how many more churches, how many more names have been lost in the name of obedience, in the name of faith, in the name of progress. And what will you do with that knowledge? What will you do now?